In the absolute dead of an Arctic winter, the cold does not merely touch your skin. It hunts you down, crystallizes the moisture in your eyes within seconds, and can freeze a man's lungs solid if he dares to draw a sudden, panicked breath. On this particular December afternoon in 1923, the Melville Peninsula of Arctic Canada felt less like a geographical location and more like an active, breathing adversary. The landscape was a monochromatic wilderness of ice and wind-scoured stone, where the horizon had long since been swallowed by a frozen, violet mist. The polar night was descending with a silent, heavy finality, bringing with it a drop in barometric pressure that made the joints of the old Eldersache. Tariq, a quiet hunter of 53 winters, stood beside his heavy wooden sled. His eyes narrowed as he studied the sky. He had spent his entire life reading the subtle signs of the northern range, the specific angle of the wind-drifted snow, the peculiar green hue that tinged the clouds just before the bare sky opened up, and the deep, low hum of the wind as it vibrated across the vast sea ice. To Tariq, the tundra was not a void. It was an incredibly complex environment governed by ancient physical laws that his ancestors had spent thousands of years deciphering. Beside him stood his 19-year-old nephew, Nuka. Nuka was young, strong, and visibly impatient. He had spent the last 12 months working at a busy Hudson's Bay Company trading post further south, where he had become accustomed to the warmth of coal-fired stoves and the convenience of manufactured tools. Nuka looked down at the wooden sled, then at the vast expanse of white, his face pinched with a mixture of cold and frustration. He wore store-bought wool trousers underneath his caribou skin leggings, believing that the modern fabric offered a superior shield against the elements. To Nuka, his uncle's quiet, disciplined preparations felt like unnecessary relics of a primitive age. He believed that the modern tools of the trading post had made the ancient skills of his people obsolete. He wanted to push forward, to reach the northern hunting grounds before the dark fully locked the land. But Tariq remained motionless, his hand resting on the wooden runner of the sled. The wind was shifting, turning steadily to the northwest, and the air had taken on a thin, sharp quality that experienced hunters knew meant only one thing: an Arctic gale force. Storm of historic proportions was about to sweep down from the polar cap. As the first freezing gusts began to whip across the ice, carrying with them a fine, needle-like drift that stung any exposed skin, Nuka reached into the back of the sled and pulled out his most prized possessions. With a triumphant grin that was quickly stiffened by the frost, he revealed a heavy, double-threaded, cotton canvas wall tent and a gleaming brass pressurized kerosene stove. He www.com dropped them onto the hard-packed snow, his voice raised to compete with the rising hum of the wind. He argued that they did not need to waste hours searching for building materials when they had the finest technology of the Pard South right here on the sled. He claimed that the canvas tent could be pitched in 10 minutes, and the pressurized stove would produce a dry, intense heat would keep them warm throughout the night. Tariq did not answer immediately. He walked around the sled, checking the sealskin lashings, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at the bright canvas tent, then at the sky, and finally at his nephew. He knew that cotton canvas, while strong, had no thermal resistance of its own. It was merely a thin membrane that would flap and rattle in the wind, conducting the freezing cold directly into the interior. He knew that the wind on these open plains was not a simple breeze, but a relentless force that would find any flat surface and use it as a sail to tear the structure apart. And he knew the limits of pressurized kerosene in extreme temperatures. "This is not the South, Nuka," Tariq said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the wind. "Here, the wind is a knife that slices canvas like paper, and kerosene is a liquid that forgets how to flow when the land turns to white shadow." If we trust our lives to these things tonight, we will not see the morning sun. Nuka's jaw tightened. He felt patronized by his uncle's old-fashioned warnings, believing that Tariq was simply too stubborn to accept the superiority of modern engineering. He argued that the traders used these tents all winter, forgetting that the traders set them up in protected forest valleys, not on the exposed, wind-blasted sea ice of the high Arctic. He insisted that they pitch the tent immediately, determined to prove that his modern ways were the future of their people. The storm did not arrive gradually. It exploded across the peninsula. Within an NUX hour, the temperature plummeted from a manageable -25 degrees to a brutal, bone-chilling -48 degrees Celsius. The wind screamed at 50 kilometers per hour, turning the loose snow into a blinding, horizontal sheet of white that obliterated all visibility. Nuka, desperate to prove his crime point, struggled to unfold the stiffening canvas. The cold had turned the heavy inflashdo cotton into a rigid, unyielding sheet that refused to bend. He fought to slide the wooden poles into their sleeves, but his fingers, even inside his thick mitts, were rapidly losing sensation. A sudden, violent gust of wind caught the canvas. The tent inflated like a sail, generating an immense force that yanked Nuka off his feet. He was dragged across the hard ice, his boots sliding uselessly, until Tariq lunged forward and threw his weight onto the canvas, pinning it to the ground. With a sharp, metallic crack, the main wooden support pole snapped under the wind's immense pressure. The canvas thrashed wildly, a corner tearing free and vanishing into the white papeline chaos of the storm. Nuka scrambled up, his face pale with a sudden icy fear. He reached for his brass kerosene stove, hoping to at least ignite a flame to warm his hands, but the cold had done its work. The pressurized liquid inside had thickened into a cloudy, useless gel that refused to vaporize. The stove hissed weakly once, then went completely silent. Nuka stood in the screaming wind, his body beginning to shake uncontrollably. He looked at the broken tent, then at the useless stove, and realized with a sickening clarity that he was completely defenseless. The modern tools he had trusted had failed him in the first hour of the storm. Tariq did not offer a word of criticism. He simply reached into the sled, pulled out his snow probe and his snow knife, and looked at his nephew. "Drop the canvas, Nuka," he said, calmly, his voice steady against the roar of the gale. "It belongs to the wind. Now, we must build a home out of the snow, or the ice will have us before midnight." Nuka nodded, his pride entirely shattered by the cold, and followed his uncle into the white darkness. As they struggled through the blinding drift, the wind-chill temperature dropped to what felt like -60 degrees Celsius. Nuka's hands were stiffening, and the early signs of frostbite were beginning to cloud his cheeks with white patches. He looked around the vast, featureless plain of ice and snow, seeing only an enemy that was trying to kill them. He could not understand how they could possibly build a warm shelter out of the very cold that was threatening to destroy them. To Nuka, snow was simply frozen water, a cold and wet substance that had no place in a heating plan. Tariq stopped near a deep drift, his body positioned to shield his nephew from the worst of the wind. He began to explain the core paradox of the Arctic builder. "You look at this white desert and see only cold, Nuka," Tariq said, his voice carrying the calm authority of an instructor. "But within this cold lies the only warmth we have. Snow is not just frozen water. It is a shield, if you know how to choose it." He explained that soft, freshly fallen powder was useless. It contained too much air and had no structural strength, collapsing under its own weight. Conversely, solid glacier ice was a thermal liability. Because ice is dense and contains no air pockets, it conducts heat 80 times faster than trapped air, acting as a massive thermal bridge that would draw heat directly out of their bodies. They needed wind-packed snow, known as Pukangajuk. Tariq explained that this snow had been hammered by Arctic gales for weeks, physically breaking the delicate, six-sided arms of the snowflakes and packing them into a tight, interlocking molecular mesh. This packed snow was hard enough to support the Fati/interlocking molecular mesh weight of a grown man, yet it retained millions of microscopic air pockets trapped between the broken crystals. These pockets acted as a natural barrier to heat transfer, creating an insulation value that outperformed many wood structures. Tariq unstrapped his sabagut, the snow probe crafted from reindeer, antler, and thrust it deep into the drift to find this elusive material. Tariq handed the sabagut to Nuka, guiding his stiff hands as he pushed the plost antler probe into the snowbank. "You must learn to feel the snow," Nuka, Tariq, instructed. "Your eyes cannot see the strength of the wind's work. Only your hands can tell you if the snow is ready." He had Nuka plunge the probe into different areas of the drift, explaining the tactile feedback of the material. If the antler slid in with almost no resistance like grease, it was soft, powder. It had no strength and would collapse, burying them in their sleep. If the probe stopped with a sharp, metallic jar, it was solid ice. It would offer no insulation, turning their shelter into a freezing meat locker. They searched for the middle ground, the precise depth where the antler pushed with a firm, steady, crunching resistance. This was the Goldilocks zone of Arctic construction, where the snow possessed the perfect balance of structural integrity and air pocket insulation. Nuka focused on the sensation, feeling the resistance change as the probe penetrated different layers of the drift. He felt a soft layer, then a hard crust, and finally, a deep, uniform layer of dense, packed snow that offered a consistent, solid resistance. Tariq nodded in approval as Nuka identified the spot. To confirm the find, Tariq drew his pana, the snow knife, and drove the blade vertically into the snow. He told Nuka to listen to the sound. As the blade cut through the packed crystals, it made a distinct, high-pitched screech-scratch sound. This sound, Tariq explained, was the song of the interlocking crystal bonds. It indicated that the wind had packed the snow with enough density to hold a structural load without fracturing or crumbling under pressure. The material was perfect. They had found their quarry, and now they had to extract the blocks before the cold completely immobilized their limbs. Tariq demonstrated the methodical process of harvesting the building blocks. He used his pana, a long-bladed knife that functioned as a saw, a chisel, and a measuring device. He showed Nuka how to use his own forearm as the standard unit of measure, ensuring that every block would be perfectly proportioned to their bodies without the need for external scales. This ancient, body-based measurement guaranteed that the blocks would be consistent, allowing them to fit flush against one another to minimize gaps and maximize the structural tension of the dome. Tariq initiated the harvest with the X-cut, carving a large diagonal cross into the snow face to create a flat, clean starting edge. He then cut two parallel vertical lines roughly 30 centimeters deep, followed by a horizontal score at the base. With a series of quick, deep jabs at the bottom, he used the snow's natural cleavage planes and gravity to pop the block out of the drift. The block was massive, roughly 80 centimeters long and weighing nearly 30 kilograms, yet it lifted cleanly, its edges sharp and defined. Most importantly, Tariq explained the strategy of circular logistics. They were not transporting blocks from a distance. They were cutting them directly from the interior floor of the planned igloo. This organized plan solved two critical engineering problems at once. First, it eliminated the energy cost of moving heavy materials across the ice. Second, by excavating the floor, they created a natural pit that added vertical headroom without requiring additional rows of blocks. This pit would also serve as the cold sump, a deep trench where the heaviest, coldest air would settle, keeping the freezing drafts far below the raised living area they would construct. Nuka watched his uncle work with a growing respect, realizing that every cut was a calculated step in a highly coordinated plan of survival. Tariq and Nuka began laying the first ring of snow blocks around the excavated foundation circle. Each block was positioned with its rougher, wind-packed side, facing outward to resist the scouring action of the storm, while the smoother, cut side faced inward. Nuka struggled to lift his end of the heavy blocks, his muscles burning from the cold and the physical exertion. He watched as Tariq placed the first 3 blocks, then drew his snow knife, and did something that seemed entirely counterproductive. He cut a gradual, 15-degree diagonal ramp into the top of the blocks, starting from the first block and rising to the third. Nuka stared at the sloped edge, his brow furrowing. To his mind, building walls required level, horizontal rows, just like the timber cabins he had seen in the south. He believed that an angled wall would be unstable, causing the subsequent blocks to slide off and collapse. Tariq shook his head, explaining the mechanical necessity of the spiral. A house of blocks built in flat rings is weak, Nuka, Tariq explained. While you build, the blocks lean inward toward the center. If they are in flat rings, there is nothing to hold them from falling until the ring is complete. They will fall and crush you. But a spiral never stops. It is one continuous block that climbs to the sky. By cutting the ramp, Tariq had initiated a continuous spiral architecture. Because of this sloped foundation, every subsequent block they placed would rest on 2 distinct points of contact: the horizontal surface of the row below and the vertical side of the previous block. This dual support created a self-supporting system that grew structurally stronger as it tilted inward toward the center. The blocks locked each other in place through mutual compression, eliminating the need for temporary wooden supports or internal framework. Nuka began to understand that the circular dome was not an aesthetic choice. It was a highly sophisticated geometric solution to the problem of building without timber or iron. As they began the second tier of the spiral, the angle of the walls inclined sharply inward. Nuka held the blocks in place, his shoulders aching as he supported the weight of the leaning snow. He was convinced that the moment he let go, the block would slide down and shatter on the floor. But Tariq did not tell him to hold it indefinitely. Instead, as soon as the block was fitted tight against its neighbor, Tariq delivered a sharp, calculated strike with the palm of his hand against the side of the block, a physical maneuver known as centering. "Let go, Nuka," Tariq said. Nuka hesitated, then slowly released his grip. To his amazement, the block remained suspended in midair, defying gravity as it leaned at a 30-degree angle over the floor. Tariq explained the molecular physics of the strike. "Snow is alive, Nuka. It is made of tiny crystals of ice. When you strike the block, you create a moment of great pressure and friction. This pressure melts a microscopic layer of the crystals where the blocks touch. When the pressure stops, the water freezes again instantly, welding the blocks together into a single bone of ice. This process, known in modern material science as sintering, transformed the igloo from a pile of individual bricks into a monolithic, high-strength shell. The continuous molecular bonding meant that the structural load was distributed evenly across the entire surface of the dome, rather than resting on individual joints. Nuka felt the wall with his hand. It no longer felt like separate blocks, 2 of snow. It felt like a single, solid curve of stone, cold and incredibly rigid, capable of resisting the immense external pressure of the wind. Nuka's hands were freezing, but his mind was warming to the brilliant, quiet science of his uncle's work. The spiral climbed rapidly, the opening at the top of the dome shrinking with each completed turn. The walls now curved overhead, forming a tight, inverted parabola, the catenary arch. Nuka looked up at the small opening, remaining at the Biliana green apex, wondering how they would close the gap without the ceiling collapsing on their heads. The wind was screaming outside, throwing snow against the exterior, walls with a sound like gravel, but the dome held steady, showing no vibration, no movement. Tariq climbed onto the raised snow platform inside and began carving the king block, the most critical component of the entire structure. He shaped it with his panna, cutting it into a wedge that was wider at the top than the bottom, a high-precision maneuver that required his decades of experience. He passed the block up through the top opening, rotated it 90 degrees horizontally, and then lowered it gently back down into the gap, snugging it like a mechanical plug. The moment the king block settled, Nuka felt a subtle shift in the structure. The downward force of the wedge instantly converted the entire weight of the wedge dome into a continuous, outward compressive force, locking every block into a compressive state of structural equilibrium. The catenary shape ensured that there were no bending or tensile forces acting on the snow, forces that would cause the blocks to crack in the extreme cold. Every ounce of weight was channeled directly into the ground through compression. Tariq climbed down, his face creased with a quiet satisfaction. The dome was locked. Nuka stood in the sudden stillness of the interior, looking at the seamless vault of snow above him, and realized that they had built a fortress out of the storm itself, using nothing but a knife and the laws of geometry. With the main dome sealed, Tariq began the final, critical stage of the interior layout. He dropped into the excavated pit and began digging the long entrance tunnel that would connect the igloo to the outside world. He excavated a 3-meter corridor that sloped downward, dropping nearly 50 centimeters below the level of the main floor, before rising again to emerge outside. Nuka, his energy returning as he worked in the windless interior, helped haul the windless interior loose snow out of the tunnel. Tariq explained the fluid dynamics of this specific configuration. Cold air is heavy, Nuka, he said, gesturing to the deep trench of the tunnel. It behaves like water. It flows downhill, seeking the lowest point. By digging this tunnel, lower than our living floor, we create a trap. The freezing wind from outside will enter the tunnel, fall into this pit, and become stuck. It cannot rise into the dome because the warm air inside is light and buoyant, holding the cold down, like a lid on a pot. This cold sump created an incredibly effective natural airlock. The freezing drafts were physically prevented from entering the living zone, ensuring that the interior air column remained stable and warm. To complete the envelope, Tariq cut a small 4-centimeter ventilation hole near the apex of the dome. He explained that a sealed igloo was a dangerous trap. Their own breathing and the combustion of their lamp would quickly deplete the oxygen, leading to silent carbon monoxide poisoning. The vent allowed stale air to escape, drawing fresh air in through the low tunnel in a controlled, slow-motion exchange. Finally, they shoveled loose, fine powdered snow over the entire exterior of the dome, filling every microscopic gap between the blocks to create a windproof, erosion-resistant outer armor. They crawled back through the low, baffled entrance tunnel, sealing the outer opening with a temporary block of snow. Nuka pulled off his frozen outer mitts, his hands stiff and red, and looked around the dark, silent interior. The roaring chaos of the blizzard outside was reduced to a faint, rhythmic vibration that made the space feel incredibly secure. Tariq reached into his pack and retrieved his kulik, a shallow, carved soapstone lamp filled with rendered seal blubber, the traditional radiator of his people. He carefully prepared the wick, using dried Arctic cotton grass that he had gathered during the brief summer months. He pressed the fibers into the blubber, saturated them with the oil, and then struck a spark using a piece of flint and steel. The wick caught, a small, yellow flame flickering to life in the wick, Darkness. Tariq used his takudi, a small bone tool, to meticulously trim the wick, flattening the fibers until the flame turned a bright, clean, smokeless blue. The heat from the small lamp rose, immediately beginning to warm the cold air of the dome. Within 20 minutes, the physical transformation of the interior began. As the transformation of the interior, air temperature climbed, the innermost surface of the snow blocks began to melt, slightly, forming a thin, glistening layer of moisture. But the blocks did not collapse. The extreme cold from the outside, conducted through the thick walls, met the warmth from the inside, refreezing the moisture into a smooth, glass-like film of ice. This was the ice glazing effect. Tariq explained that this ice film was their ultimate shield. It sealed every remaining microscopic pore in the snow, preventing any air leakage, and acted as an infrared mirror, reflecting the radiant heat emitted by their own bodies back into the center of the room, turning the igloo into a highly efficient thermal battery. Nuka lay on his side, his body exhausted from the long hours of physical labor and the intense cold stress. His shivering had stopped, replaced by a deep, heavy fatigue. Tariq reached into his pack and pulled out a skin-wrapped bundle of iguanodon walrus meat that had been buried in the ground during the summer to undergo anaerobic fermentation. He cut a thin slice and handed it to his nephew. Nuka hesitated. At the trading post, he had become used to canned beef, biscuits, and the strong, pungent smell of the fermented meat made his stomach turn. But Tariq insisted. "Eat, Nuka," he said gently. "Your body is cold because it has no fuel. This meat is the fire your ancestors carried. It will warm you faster than any stove." Nuka took a bite, chewing the rich, fatty meat. The biochemistry of the traditional diet was precise. Because the meat had been pre-processed through fermentation, the complex proteins were already broken down, requiring almost no digestive energy from Nuka's body. The raw calories and fats converted directly into metabolic heat, sending a wave of genuine warmth through his core within minutes. Nuka felt his muscles relax, the deep, aching chill in his bones finally beginning to recede. They climbed onto the raised sleeping platform, the igloo, which sat 50 centimeters above the floor. Here, in the warmest zone near the ceiling, the temperature held at a comfortable 10 degrees Celsius, while outside, the Arctic gales screamed at -52. Nuka wrapped himself in his caribou skin parka, looking at the steady blue flame of the kulik, and realized that his uncle's ancient design had done what his modern tent and stove could never do. It had given them a safe, warm, and silent sanctuary in the middle of a killing storm. The morning arrived with a quiet, brilliant clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a frozen, pristine world of sparkling ice and scoured snow under a pale blue sky. Inside the igloo, the light did not come from a dark, soot-stained opening. It filtered through the ice lens, the block of clear, freshwater lake ice that Tariq had installed in the wall the previous evening. Because freshwater ice contains no salt, it is transparent, unlike the cloudy, opaque saltwater ice of the surrounding sea. The morning sun shone through this lens, refracting the light and flooding the interior of the dome with a beautiful, calm, azure glow. Nuka woke, his body warm and rested, his breathing regular. He looked at the thermometer he had carried in his pocket. The temperature inside held steady at 12 degrees Celsius. Just inches away, on the other side of the snow wall, the air was still a freezing -50 degrees. The contrast was staggering. He lay in his sleeping bag, looking at the glistening ice-glazed dome above him, and felt a profound sense of peace. He realized that they had survived the worst storm of his life, in complete safety and comfort, protected by nothing more than a mound of snow and the quiet intelligence of his uncle's design. Nuka crawled out through the entrance tunnel, standing in the blinding sunlight, of the tundra. He looked at his modern canvas tent, now a shredded, useless rag, flapping in the breeze, its wooden supports broken and half buried in the snow. He looked at his brass kerosene stove, its fuel frozen solid, looking like a piece of useless scrap metal on the ice. He realized then the deep, arrogant foolishness of his beliefs. He had trusted his life to imported tools made by people who had never seen an Arctic winter, believing that newer was automatically better. He turned to his uncle, who was packing the sled, his movements as calm and unhurried as they had been before the storm. Nuka stood silent for the moment, his chest tight with a mixture of shame and gratitude. "I was wrong, Tariq," Nuka said, his voice quiet in the cold air. "I thought your ways were primitive, that they were a shadow we needed to leave behind. But this snow house saved our lives. It is smarter than anything they sell at the post." Tariq stopped his work. He looked at his nephew, his weathered face creased with a warm, gentle smile. He walked to his pack, retrieved his panna, the snow knife, and held it out. The steel blade glistened in the morning sun, its handle carved from reindeer antler, worn smooth by decades of his own hands. "This is not a shadow, Nuka," Tariq said, placing the knife in his nephew's hands. "It is a light. Our ancestors paid for this knowledge with their survival. It is your turn to carry it." Nuka took the knife, feeling the weight of the steel and the decade history it represented, and knew that his journey on the tundra had finally begun. With the sled packed and the dogs harnessed, Tariq and Nuka set off across the Manyan, sparkling, frozen expanse of the Melville Peninsula. The Comatique sled, its flexible sealskin lashings absorbing every impact of the uneven ice, glided smoothly behind them. In the distance, the small circular dome of the igloo remained standing, a quiet monument of snow and gravity that would endure for weeks, a testament to the fact that survival is not a struggle against the environment, but a quiet, disciplined harmony with it. Nuka rode beside his uncle, his hand resting on the smooth antler handle of the snow knife tucked into his belt. He was returning to his people not as a boy, dependent on store-bought wool and imported fuel, but as a young hunter who had received the inherited blueprint of his ancestors. He understood now that true progress does not mean forgetting where we came from, but carrying the lessons of the past into the challenges of the future. The lessons of the Igluvigac remain carved into the Arctic memory, as relevant today as they were generations ago. In a world of increasing complexity, rising energy costs, the simple, elegant dome of snow stands as a timeless reminder of human ingenuity. It proves that the most sophisticated solutions to our greatest challenges do not always require more materials and more expense, but simply the humility to remember the wisdom our ancestors already paid for with their survival.